You cannot buy the revolution. You cannot make the revolution. You can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit, or it is nowhere. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thanks for spending some time with me today. So today I want to talk about Ursula K. Le Guin's 1974 masterpiece, The Dispossessed. So I guess this is a review, I suppose, though the book has been out for quite a while, so maybe review isn't the right term. This is an incredible book, and especially right now, considering what is going on in the world, the relationship between everyday people and the elite ruling class is at that relationship has a tension that's at an all-time high, and I think this book speaks to that in a really beautiful way. So it felt like a really opportune time to have a discussion about this book. So this story is part of Ursula K. Le Guin's Hainish cycle, which is a series of, I think, 7 novels and a number of short stories that are all set in the same universe. And the idea of that universe is that Hain, the planet Hain, millennia ago, they basically became interstellar colonizers, and they spread out throughout the galaxies, and they seeded life on all these other planets. So any planet that has human or human-like life are really descendants from Hain, including Earth. And now this book takes place mostly on the planet Urus, as well as its moon, which is called Anaris, though it is often thought of as its own planet. And the premise of the book is, you can think of Anaris very similar to Earth, and we are spending most of our time on Anaris on one country, which is considered the most powerful country on the planet, that is Ao, and that's kind of a parallel for the US. You can think of it as a parallel to the US, and you wouldn't be wrong in terms of their role in global politics and so forth. Now, at some point, there is a woman named Odo who leads a revolution, essentially of the working class against the masters. And she's arrested numerous times. She's in jail for years and years, and she eventually dies on Urus. However, her ideas don't die, and there is a huge revolution in her wake of her followers that call themselves Adonians. And eventually, the world governments decide, in order to quell the revolution, they say, look, you can have the moon. You can go to the moon and start your own colony, and we'll leave you alone. And that way, we don't have to keep having this fighting here. And now the moon itself already had been colonized. There were some mining colonies on the moon, because the moon isn't quite like Earth's moon. It is habitable, but it's very, very difficult. It's a hard place to live. But it has a lot of rare minerals that they need on Urus. So there were already some mining colonies that existed on the moon, but they were just temporary colonies. And so the world government said, look, you go to the moon, you go to Anaris, and we will offload all the mining colonists, and you can have it. And so over the course of like a year or so, all these colonists go up to the moon. And then after that first year or so, when they finally settled, they basically cut off almost all communication with the main planet of Urus, okay? There is still a ship that arrives 8 times a year, and they provide some of these minerals from the mines that they need on the main planet, and the main planet provides some things that they can't get on the moon, such as different types of plants and other things like this. So there is a very tense, unwanted relationship, a relationship that is contested a lot by the people on Anaris. And the reason is because on Anaris, they are anarchists, so they practice anarchism. So anarchism as a political or social movement is a form or a subversion of socialism. It is sometimes called libertarian socialism. So think of socialism and the idea of solidarity and equality across all people, and then remove any taste of any sort of central authority, any political authority, any centralized leadership at all. And that is what you have with anarchism. And Ursula K. Le Guin herself was an outspoken anarchist. So in many ways, Anaris is showing the possibility of an anarchist utopia, right? At least that's the idea. And our story takes place 170 years after the settling of Anaris. Our main character is a man named Shevik, and he is a theoretical physicist, essentially. And he is one of the few people that has some sort of communication with the main planet, because so much of the physics that he is learning and studying was originally done on the main planet, right? Because they're still a young planet. They're only 170 years old. So he had to learn their language, because when the colonists came in that first year, they made up their own language. So on the moon, they only speak this new language they invented just for their planet. So he learned Iotic, which is the language of the main country, Ao, on the planet, Urus. And he's the one person, or one of a very few people, who have some sort of communication with that main planet. And the story starts with him going to Urus. And he is going there to help expand his ideas, right? His physics, he's hit a border, he's hit a wall, and he needs to somehow find a way to get over that wall. And he believes that going to have conversations with the physicists there and being there in person will be able to help him move his theoretical ideas past whatever blocks he has. At the same time, he thinks it is critical for his society to engage in more conversation with other worlds. Part of the way this anarchist planet has maintained its identity is by cutting off all communication. So they're intensely xenophobic, and he feels that this is not working, that this is not a way forward. This is not proving that the value of anarchy as a organizing principle is useful. Right? So he has these multiple goals, these multiple aims of both expanding the minds of the people that live on Anaris, but also he wants to build upon and evolve his own ideas and the physics that he is working out. Now, famously, the character of Shevik is based on Oppenheimer, who was a family friend of Ursula K. Guin's family when she was growing up, so she met him numerous times. I think the only reason that's useful to think about is we think about, physics and theoretical physics especially seem like almost esoteric, right? But if you look at someone like Oppenheimer and the power of the science that he brought to the world, that power has incredibly creative potential and incredible destructive potential, obviously. And so this idea that the ideas behind something that may seem esoteric, such as theoretical physics, are really powerful. And that power itself is neutral, but it can be used one way or the other depending on who harnesses that power. So in the same way that Oppenheimer's work led to the atomic bomb, which caused mass destruction, Shevik's work, hypothetically, has that same potentiality. And instead of doing that work on his own country, where he is a dedicated anarchist, he's now going to this capitalist, consumer-based country where everything is about ownership. And so what is going to happen to these ideas if that is the environment in which they grow, in which they prosper? So that is one thing to be thinking about, and where the comparison to Oppenheimer is useful. Now, it's worth saying the physics that he is exploring, I mean, they're speculative fiction physics. They don't have to make sense, but they're useful because they play a part in the overall themes of the story. So the main problem he is wrestling with is time, and the idea of time, and the idea that our experience of time is that it's always going in one direction, and that we are experiencing time in very specific ways. Yet he believes that the idea of simultaneity also exists, that all things exist simultaneously, and that time exists in cycles, political cycles, historical cycles, emotional cycles, and so forth. And so he believes that he can combine these two theories of the fact that our experience of time as being linear and moving in one direction does not have to necessarily contradict with the idea that all things are happening simultaneously in a cyclical nature. Now, again, don't worry about the physics of it, if that's really possible or not, but the idea of that is useful because you see shadows of that in other themes across the book and in the way he relates to people. One of the examples he gives about this physics is that he says, imagine reading a book. When you're reading a book, no matter where you are in the book, in the beginning or the middle or the end, you believe the book is only unfolding in one direction, and your experience of the book is always moving in a linear direction wherever you are. Doesn't matter. Yet the whole book is already written, right? The whole book exists simultaneously regardless of your experience of that book. And yet at the same time, his argument is that there is no predetermination to the outcome of existence, even if it is simultaneous. So those are some of these ideas that he is grappling with, this idea of cyclical repetition and also experiential relativity. And I'll talk a little bit more about the ideas at the end. But first, the writing of the book, I think, is really playful. If you've read any of Le Guin, you know the writing. There's a little bit of distance to the writing. It isn't a highly emotional type of writing, but what emotion is there is really vivid, right? It is on the surface. And yet it also is forcing you to really be contemplative. The writing itself is contemplative, and it draws you in. This book really is a book about ideas. So it's not a book so much about plot or about characters. There is plot, and the character of Shevik especially is incredibly well developed and really well rounded, and a very multi-dimensional character. And almost all the ancillary characters, especially his friends and his family, his classmates and so forth, they also are interesting. None of them feel flat. None of them feel two-dimensional. Some of the characters that he meets on Uris do feel a little bit two-dimensional, but I think that's kind of on purpose. This idea that living as proprietarians, right, in this capitalist consumerist society, it flattens their identity because it limits their understanding of what potential they have as humans. So some of those characters are a little bit flat. Not all of them, though. Some of them are still really interesting. So there are really interesting and multidimensional characters throughout the book, but it isn't a character study, even though this really is about Shevik's journey, right? Because Shevik, not only is he this great physicist, he really is an anarchist. He really does believe this to his heart. And one of the reasons that he wants to visit Uris is that he sees on his planet that some of the ideals of anarchism are breaking down, because there are people that seem to want to have control, that are allowing their greed to motivate their actions, where they're focusing on themselves and not the whole, right? And not the social body as a whole. And he believes that having more communication with outside countries, or outside worlds rather, would help reinvigorate the anarchist spirit. And that is, I think, an important part of the story. As much as anarchism is lauded as this really beautiful ideology. At the same time, it isn't shown to be perfect. And in fact, the only way it can work is if you are given a whole planet and you get to start from scratch, right? So even though Le Guin is an anarchist, and she is showing that anarchism and some of the ideals of anarchism is beneficial and is a more wholesome way to live in the world, she isn't showing it as easy. She isn't showing it as perfect. She isn't saying that it is free from devolving into something else if you aren't careful, right? So we go on this journey with Shevik of him really trying to hold tight to these ideals of anarchism, which get difficult on the main planet when he's there, when he's surrounded by luxury in this gilded cage that is Urus. Now, the plotting and structure of the novel, I think, is really smart, and it is alternating between his time on the main planet, on Urus, and his time on his own planet, on Anaris. So starting with the first chapter, he is getting onto this spaceship and traveling to Urus, right? And all of the on chapters are him in real time. That's the present going forward in his time on Urus, and him engaging with this whole other community, this whole other culture, and so forth. The even number chapters, starting with chapter 2, are telling his life and his experiences on his home planet. And they start when he's a child, and then they go all the way up until he leaves the planet. So you could actually read all of the even number chapters and then all of the odd number chapters, and it would be perfectly chronological if you were to read it that way. Now, obviously, dealing with multiple timelines isn't a wildly new idea, but it does reflect the thematic ideals of the cyclical nature of time and how things exist simultaneously, right? As I mentioned, one of the things Le Guin is playing with through Shevik's theoretical physics is this idea of all things existing simultaneously. So when you have two parallel timelines and one of them is moving much faster than the other, our main storyline takes place over about the span of a year, but obviously the background, the backstory, takes place over the span of about 40 years, and yet they move more or less at the same pace in terms of our page count. So you have two different storylines, the past and the present, moving at different rates of speed, yet we read them simultaneously. We exist in two times simultaneously. So the use of her structure is playing with some of the ideas and themes of the novel. And so what are those ideas? What are these themes? If this is a novel about ideas, it's important, I think, first to look at the first mention I saw of where the title comes from, the Dispossessed. And the first place I saw it mentioned is actually the opposite. So Shevik has arrived on the main planet, and he's meeting some of these other physicists who are these great minds, right? They're these incredible physicists that are great intellectuals who have been able to push his own ideas further, right? They challenged him. They allowed him to grow as a physicist. So he has respect for them. Intellectual respect for them. And he meets them and he says, where are all the women? How come there are no women in this group? And they just laugh and they say, what do you mean women? Like, women can't be part of university. Women don't have any ability to have any sort of thoughts outside of how to take care of a home, right? Because you find out that Urus is incredibly misogynistic and patriarchal in their structure. And he is blown away by this idea, right? And he's kind of making fun of them a little bit. And then he steps back and he says he shouldn't tease them because he realized the only type of relation they know is one of possession. They are possessed. And so what it means to be possessed in this telling is that everything you experience is experienced through the filter of ownership, through the filter of domination or control or possession of some sort. And that isn't just the material goods around you, but also your relationships with others. So the way the men on this world relate to the women is one of ownership, one of possession. And therefore you should feel bad for them because they are possessed, as opposed to those who are dispossessed, those who don't experience the world through ownership, through ideas of protectionism, but instead they own nothing. And because they own nothing, they experience the world through a sense of freedom that is devoid of this idea of domination or of control. Right? So that's what it means to be dispossessed. And to be dispossessed is to be not concerned with ownership and instead to be concerned with freedom. So one of the things that the anarchists and Shevik especially are idolizing is the fact that the community is always more important than the individual. So ownership, anything that is egoizing, anything that is drawing attention to yourself or wanting to claim something for yourself is always going to be hurting the larger whole because the community is always more important than the individual. And yet there is still a way to be an individual that has a meaningful existence as part of a larger whole. So it's trying to find that balance of what does it mean to be me and to be an important contributing factor of something bigger than myself. Not lose myself as part of that whole, but also recognize that the good for all is more important than the good for me. Now, in a lot of these ideas, you see Le Guin's Taoist influences and also some Buddhist influences, especially in some of her ruminations on ideas of suffering, as well as ideas of relativity, right? The opening scene of the book isn't focused on the characters. It's focused on the small area where the spaceship lands on Anaris. And it's focused on the walls. So it's one of the few places in the country where there are freestanding walls that are creating a dividing line between something. And the book has this obsession with walls. What are created by walls? And now these walls in particular that you open the book with, they don't actually keep anyone out. Anyone can climb over them, but they still create a demarcating line. And the narration starts with the idea that what those walls do depends on which side of the walls you're on. On one side, what those walls do is they shut out everything that is Anaris. They shut out everything that is this anarchist planet, and they have a small safe haven that is protected from that, social pollution. But from the other side, they enclose Anaris. They limit it. They cause it to be smaller than it needs to be. So what are walls doing? Throughout the story, there is a continued return to this idea of walls, of boundaries, of borders. What does it mean, both in terms of metaphysical walls, but also physical walls? What does it mean to want to hold something out? And when you are pushing something out or keeping something away, what is then being stunted on the other side? What are you not allowing to grow on the inside? Because you are creating this false demarcation, right? At one point, there's a mention that the only proper function of an individual in society is to unbuild walls. That is what our goal should be. To be continually unbuilding walls, both physical walls, but more importantly, metaphysical walls. So the story doesn't open on our main character. Instead, it opens on the idea of boundaries and how the experience of those boundaries is always relative, depending on what perspective you take. Again, this idea of relativity and what do we understand through relativity is another important theme that you see again and again. In one of the scenes from Shevik's childhood, he's with a bunch of his friends and they are laying on the hill watching the moon, right? And yet the moon itself is Earth, it's a planet. And so one of them says, our Earth is their moon, and our moon is their Earth. So then another one asks, well, where then is truth? And he answers, truth is in the hill upon which one happens to be sitting. Our understanding of reality is all dependent upon our own experience. There is no such thing as a fixed or permanent truth. Truth itself is relative. It is due to experience. It is due to how you perceive the world and how you engage with that perception of the world. And through this idea of relativity and of experience being relative and yet critical to our understanding of our role in society, there is exploration of what does it mean to be part of community? What do I bring to community? What do I bring to others? And what do I take from others? What kind of role do I play in this larger organism? And what responsibilities do I have? What responsibilities do I have to myself, to my family, to my friends, or to society as a whole? Where does the idea of solidarity come with my own perception of myself? Do I have responsibility that's beyond my own worldly happiness? Do I have responsibility that is more than just me and mine? And how is that mediated in a society that has no authority, has no central government, has no rules? At one point, Shevik is criticized and he says, on Anaris, since you're all anarchists, that means you have no morality because you have no rules. The absence of rules, this man-made concept of right and wrong, therefore means you can't have any morality. And his response is no. It's not that we don't have morality. He says, my society is an attempt to reach pure morality. To throw out the moralizing, yes. The rules, the laws, the punishments, we throw those out so that men can actually see good and evil and choose between them. That is where real moral truth lies, right? In individual choice, in recognizing a decision, not being coerced into a certain type of behavior, but recognizing how to exist as part of a whole that is more important than yourself. That is where morality lies for the anarchists. And that is where they see the capitalists and the consumers and the proletarians, as they call them, as being totally not just amoral, but immoral. Because instead of recognizing the distinction between good and evil, or harmful and helpful, they are just relying upon what others tell them. And instead of doing any sort of investigation of how they can be participating in something bigger than themselves, they're focused on how to protect what is theirs, what they have a right to, what they have ownership of. Right? So all of their motivations are filtered through the lens of possession, and therefore inherently through the lens of greed. And there can't be any morality in that. It's impossible. So that is another one of the main ideas explored. What does it mean to be in community? What does it mean to be yourself, an individual who is responsible for the well-being of everyone else in your community? And so ultimately, this story, it doesn't paint a rosy picture of anarchism as a potential social organization. It shows it to be really difficult. Yet it shows the ideals of anarchism, and you could say of socialism as well to some extent, to be really beneficial because it's looking at the individual and it's saying, I'm not as important as my siblings. my social siblings, right? This whole is bigger than the individual. And therefore, solidarity, that is what matters. It matters that I care about others and that I bring my whole self to be of service to others. And only through that can we create a society that is truly free. A society that doesn't need moralizing, that doesn't need man-made rules or laws, because we've created a system where we all uphold what is for the greater good. At one point, Shevik says, "We know that there is no help for us but from one another, that no hand will save us if we do not reach out our own hand. And the hand that reaches out is empty, as is mine. You possess nothing. You have nothing. You own nothing. You are free. All you have is what you are and what you give." And so with that, I think I will leave it. I think this is a really beautiful book. It is more about ideas than plot or character, and the writing does have a little bit of emotional distance, but because of that, when you have these deeply emotional moments, they are more vivid, they're more real, and it really is celebrating and exploring the idea of what does it mean to understand yourself as part of a bigger community? What does it mean to live a life motivated by greed or domination or ownership versus a life motivated by benefiting others and working for the greater good? And how are these ideas infiltrating all of our experience of the world? How does our personal experience, our subjective experience of everything moving in one specific direction, how does that relate to the simultaneity of infinite experiences of the whole social organism at once? And how can we be part of that infinite, simultaneous social experience as opposed to our individualistic experience? I'd love to hear your thoughts about this novel down below in the comments, but for now I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.